Hello and welcome. This is Lyndsie. I was quite sick earlier this week, and I'm hoping my voice is going to hold out through my Friday reads, and I also hope that construction is not going to start. There's a garage that's the size of a house being built across my back alley, and it's 7:15 in the morning, and I'm not sure when these guys are going to start working on it again. I have a little video clip of my garden that I took a couple of days ago, and you can hear some banging in that if you stick around for some garden shots at the end. I'm just going to try and make this as quick as possible. Tell you about 8 books that I finished this week. One thing about being sick, lots of time to read. I'm going to start out strong and end with my favorite book, as usual. I listened to one audiobook in the past week. It was a long one, 15 hours long. Build Your House Around My Body by Violet Kupersmith. And this was actually perfect for the state that I was in, feeling unwell, because it's kind of a fever dream of a story set in Vietnam. It features women characters, women who are living on the margins, including one Vietnamese American who has gone to Vietnam to teach English. She's quite unmoored, searching, and there's this fortune teller. There are supernatural beings who possess people and animals. There are lots of snakes, snake venom used as recreational drugs, which reminds me of a nonfiction book that I read a while back. It's really good, and it's called Venomous by Christie Wilcox. That mentions that practice in there too. Build Your House Around My Body. It's non-linear. It has a time span of around 60 years, and it moves around a lot in time and kind of overlaps, so the feeling of time kind of collapses. You can't really tell when something's happening, and there's quite a few characters, and it's complex and puzzling, and it does all come together in the end if you're in the mood for something a little bit creepy and very atmospheric. And I do recommend Build Your House Around My Body. I also picked up Susan Sontag's Regarding the Pain of Others. Reason being, you might remember that last week I talked about the novel My Volcano by John Elizabeth Stintzi. And in that book, one of the characters was reading Regarding the Pain of Others. And thank you, John Elizabeth Stintzi, because I really enjoyed reading her, I guess, long essay about photography and how, well, the whole ethics of what it means to look at images of suffering. It also made me think a lot about another book that I read last week, La Bona, and what is the purpose, or what good can be got from reading a book about suffering. Regarding the Pain of Others is quite a short book, and I ended up flagging, I don't know, 13, 14, 15 pages, just with quotes that I will come back to later in my commonplace book. Yeah, lots to think about in that. She revisits some of the things that she wrote earlier in her book on photography and kind of argues with herself about things that she said there. So if you've read on photography but not regarding the pain of others, you might find that really interesting too. And another nonfiction I read this week is called Tree Thieves: Crime and Survival in North America's Woods, and it's by Canadian journalist Lyndsie Bourgon. And I knew that tree theft was a thing. It actually came up in Jessica Lee's book, Two Trees Make a Forest. That's a book that's coming up for the Book Naturalist Book Club. I think it's the pick for September. I will link to Heidi and Doris's channels if you're interested in the Book Naturalist Book Club. This book's not in their Book Naturalist Book Club, but going way off topic. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the extent to which logging is illegal around the world, something like 30% of logging is illegal logging, and trees that are being taken are of course the most valuable in general, old growth trees that are hundreds of years old. It's a really eye-opening book. Probably what impressed me the most is the way that Bourgon made the effort to talk to people who do this kind of theft and investigate the socio-economic and historical background for why this is happening. And another nonfiction. This one is a memoir in graphic novel format. It's called Messy Roots, a graphic memoir of a Wuhanese American. It's by Laura Gao. So she was born in Wuhan, and when she was about 4 or 5 years old, her parents, who had been studying in the US, sent for her. So she'd been staying with her grandparents, and then she moved to the United States, to Texas, when she was a small child. And that's when she changed her name. Nobody could pronounce her Chinese name, and so she was named for Laura Bush, First Lady at the time. There's a scene at the beginning where she has traveled with her brother back to Wuhan to visit family, and it is February 2020 in the airport in Wuhan. She and her brother both wearing masks, and the other people who are traveling to San Francisco are giving them dirty looks, and so she and her brother decide to take off their masks, and they would rather risk getting sick with COVID than putting up with dirty looks from other people on the plane. In addition to being a story about dealing with bicultural identity, she's also very shy, and she's also queer. So a whole thing about fitting in and feeling unmoored. Kind of a theme, I guess, because the people that Lyndsie Bourgon talked to in Tree Thieves also feel disconnected from society. in many ways. Yeah, moving and amusing. Well, just as I feared, construction started. So I've had to move indoors to finish this, and I hope you can't hear that skill saw from this location inside. So Ready When You Are is a Australian queer YA novel by an Indigenous author, Gary Lonesborough. I think he is of the Yuin people. And in Australia, this is called The Boy from the Mish, which I think is actually a more interesting title. Ready When You Are is kind of bland, I think. Anyway, it's told first person from the point of view of Jackson, who's 17 and just figuring out that he is gay. He lives in the Mish, short for mission, a small Indigenous community on the coast of New South Wales. And he's 17, and in addition to the whole issue of being queer, there's other social issues, over policing, racism, and that sort of thing. Really get a sense of what it's like to be in this community, because it's very much centered there, with people of all ages. So little kids, his mother, his aunt, and a whole mob of cousins that descend because it's Christmas time. They come to visit from Sydney. And elders in the community, like everybody is interacting and involved. And the white people in the town nearby are very much the others in this story. So, queer contemporary realism from Australia with quite a tender romance as part of the coming out. And lots of Australian lingo, grog, footy, that sort of thing. But I noticed that the American publishers also changed words that I would expect, like, for example, truck instead of ute. So it's an interesting mix. And the book design is really quite lovely. Indigenous art as part of the book design throughout. And speaking of beautiful book design, actually beautiful art, this one is a picture book, How Beautiful, and it is by an Italian author, Antonella Capetti, translated by Lisa Topi, and the art is by Melissa Castrillón. I was introduced to her art by Jackie of Spread Book Joy in the book The Balcony, which I loved. And so this is a new one. It starts out with a caterpillar who never questions anything and has a very happy life. But then someone calls him beautiful, and he wants to find out, what does beautiful mean? So the importance of questioning, even though it can be unsettling to seek knowledge, and also because he gets all these different answers from the different animals on what it means to be beautiful. So the caterpillar has to accept that others may have confusingly different views. And so you have to ponder personal meaning. It's a tangled question. This is a delight for children, We can be searching for all the animals in the illustrations and for caregivers too. Perfect. Picture book is one that's great for both kids and adults. Next up, another book about questioning. How do you live? And this is by Genzaburo Yoshino, translated by Bruno Navasky. It was originally published back in the 1930s in Japan and not translated to English until last year. Hayao Miyazaki is going to be making his next film based on this book. I think it's going to be a couple of years yet before it comes out. And that's probably what prompted this English edition, I'm guessing. There is a foreword by Neil Gaiman. And Neil Gaiman talks about the structure of this book, which is there's a narrative about 4 boys who are about 12 years old, and it's 1 year in their life, well, especially one boy, Copper, and it's interspersed with very philosophical and historical information, scientific information, economic information, based in the form of a notebook that Copper's uncle is writing. So in the introduction, Neil Gaiman says, sometimes the joy of books that seem to contain opposing elements is realizing that without both things, you would have a lesser book. And again, this connects to the book that I was talking about last week and earlier in this video, My Volcano by John Elizabeth Stintzi, which has something of that opposing elements in it. Neil Gaiman uses Moby Dick as an example of a book that has that structure. But I found that I really liked the slow pace of this book and the ponderings. And something like that picture book I was just showing you, how beautiful. The boy in this story realizes that as he grows up, he's got to figure out things for himself about what it means to be a good person and how to live. Here's a line that I love. There is nothing more beautiful than people nurturing goodwill toward their fellow beings. There was a part in this book where the children were enamored with the story of Napoleon and how brave and heroic he was. And I was thinking, okay, this is written in the 1930s, wartime, but it does come around to think about re-examining just how heroic is somebody when they don't use their power for good. The attitude towards war, towards individual thought, individual freedom in here really resonated with me the best way. So I ended up really liking How Do You Live? My final book is called But I Live. So this is another nonfiction graphic novel, and it was put out by the New Jewish Press. It's subtitled 3 Stories of Child Survivors of the Holocaust, and edited by Schallié in Victoria, British Columbia. But there are 3 different cartoonists working with 4 different survivors of the Holocaust. All of them were children, 2 were siblings, and so that's why there's 3 separate stories. And the book is aimed at people of all ages. Participants say that they want children to be able to understand. One of them says, "My words are especially meant for you, the younger generation. Accept people who are different and spread good in the world, not bad," which kind of echoes the sentiment in How Do You Live? So the first story, A Kind of Resistance. The art is by Marian Libicki, and it's from interviews with David Schaffer. So he was born in 1931 in Bukovina, which was Romania at that time. But when his parents were born in the very same place, it was Austria, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It starts out with him talking about how in 1940 he was 9 years old and there was an order that Jews could not live in rural areas. "In the morning, we had a home and a nice garden. We were a normal family. By that night, we owned only what we could carry on a horse cart. I saw my father break the rules of the Sabbath for the first time, lighting a cigarette. From that moment, we were always running downhill, and there was no way for us to stop." The next story, 13 Secrets, Conversations with Nico and Rolf Kamp. The cartoonist here is Jalad Selektar, who is Israeli, and Nico and Rolf Kamp are Dutch. Throughout the period of their hiding during the war, they ended up moving through 13 different hiding places and keeping their identity a secret. It's interesting because they're brothers, they went through the same experience, but sometimes they remembered things differently, like the time when their pet rabbits were eaten, and one brother thought that it was for a Christmas meal and the other one thought it was at Easter time. I like the way that in all 3 of these stories, it is shown that the cartoonist is working with the survivors as that it's a cooperative effort. And, interviews are done, some filming. And the final story is probably the most moving one. But I Live, based on the memories of Emmy Arbel, and the cartoonist is Barbara Yellen, who is German, and Emmy Arbel was Dutch, now living in Israel. She and her mother were sent to Ravensbrück and later on Bergen-Belsen. So she was 4 at the start of the time when she was sent there. So as a small child, survived living in 2 different concentration camps. After these 3 graphic novel format stories, there are essays, short essays, about the situation from each of the stories, and there are sections in their own words, in some cases translated to English, and then there's also a graphic novel format behind the art, where the artists talk about how it was to work on this, how they went about doing it. A really important book that I highly recommend on this topic. I'm losing my voice. I'm going to pop in a little bit of my garden at the end of this. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye. This is the 20th of July, and this time of year is when everything is really going strong in my garden. There's yarrow. I have a special fondness for this herb. I've known about it since I was a small child because my great-grandmother would have me collect it. She said she needed it for her stomach. Well, that was a translation from my grandmother. My great-grandmother didn't speak English. She was Slovak. And I was always a little bit afraid of her. She was a tiny woman, but very intense. This red flower is Maltese cross. I've got white Maltese cross in another part of the garden, and I chose that especially because I had a little dog, Max, who was a Maltese, long-haired white dog, and so I wanted a flower with reference to him, his breed. These tall blue flowers are delphinium, and those tall yellow spikes in the background, that is a leopard plant. There's just a few peonies left of this variety. Is called White Wings. Head over to another part of the garden now. So the weeds that I have in my garden are mostly trees, and then I leave them until they get really big. Like this plant in the center, this conifer. It's much too big for that spot there, and it wasn't until this year, it's taller than me, but it wasn't until this year that I discovered it's not a spruce as I thought it was, because this year it's put out cones. Those are fir cones. So she's telling me, stop calling me a spruce, I'm a fir. Here are some of the white Maltese cross. All of the white Maltese cross. These greenish flowers are alchemilla. They are very nice in bouquets because they set off any color that they're with. Like you can see how they look with the bright fuchsia cranesbill next to them. And these are Italian bellflowers. And here are the hollyhocks. Up into the art room window.